Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, my name is Muhammad Tahkif bin Tuah, carrying ID number 22B0820. My partner Muhammad Mikash Iman bin Tahir, 22B0818. We are first year undergraduate students from the Bachelor of Science in Electric Finance Unisa, Brando Salam. So, in this video, my partner and I will be covering and explaining to detail on gross domestic products and its functions in economics, and which includes the definitions, ways to calculate GDP, like how to calculate GDP, and we're going to talk about the two parts of GDP and how it differs from each other, and what GDP is for, and how it relates to economics. And lastly, we can explain if GDP is useful and what does it mean by a high GDP and a low GDP. And does a high GDP always means a better living standards and low GDP means low living standards, and so on.
So we move on to the next part of this presentation, which is the introduction. What is GDP? There are three definitions of the GDP, which is the first one, total monetary value of all final goods and services produced that are sold within a country during a period of which is usually a year. And the second definition, the market value of the final goods and services produced in a country during a given period. And for the last definition, the dollar value of the total output of the economy in a year. Let me explain about a brief history of a GDP. An American economist known as Simon Kuznets in 1934, before World War II, has invented a concept called gross domestic product, which is known as GDP. GDP was chosen as the main indicator and measure of a country's performance at the Bretton Woods Conference back in 1944. Firstly, used by the government military strategies. So what is gross domestic and product? So gross is product to be counted regardless of their consecutive use. For example, a product can both be used for consumption, investment, and will still be counted to the total value. As for the domestic, its meaning was the goods and services that are produced within the country's border is counted as the country's GDP, notwithstanding the nationality of the producer or the manufacturer. For example, the production of a car of a Malaysia-owned factory with their base in Singapore will be counted as part of Singapore gross domestic product. And for the last part, which is the product, meaning that any production or economic output of final goods and services sold for money on the market. However, not all goods and services are counted, only those of final goods are. This is because the cost of transaction involving a goods that are used to manufacture a finished product, such as the purchase of metal used to manufacture a car, is already included and part of the total value of the final product, price of which the car is sold. So for the next part is ways to calculate GDP. How to calculate GDP? There are three ways. So for the first one is the output method. It is to add up the value of all goods and services produced in the country, industry by industry. And the second way is income method. This method of measuring GDP is to add up all incomes. The production of goods and services generates income for a household in the form of salaries and wages, profit, rent, and interest. For the third ways, it is the expenditure method, a method where it calculates all expenditures necessary to purchase the nation's production. The value of what is sold must be there for the value of what is produced. So for the parts of GDP, there is two parts of GDP. So the first one, Nominal GDP is GDP measured in terms of prices and in a year in which the output is produced, also called as GDP at current prices, is an insurance is a measure which has not been seen adjusted to inflation, can give misleading impression on how well of a country is performing as GDP may rise not because more goods or services are produced but merely just because prices have been risen. A GDP deflator is used to convert nominal GDP to real GDP. So the second part of GDP, which is the real GDP, also called as GDP at constant prices, it is a measure of price which has been adjusted to inflation, allows economists to determine whether the value of national incomes or GDP has changed because more output is sold or price have increased. Also used to calculate the percentage of fall of GDP over the year, can help economists to compare the level of real GDP from one year to another year. So that's it.
GDP plays a big role for an economy. This shows that the concept is important due to three main reasons, which are: number one, to measure economic growth or fall; second, to help managing the country; and lastly, to compare countries' performances. So, number one, GDP indicates whether a country is expanding by producing more output, or growth, or contracting due to less output, or fall. This usually relates to economics growth and development. This is because economic growth usually leads to economic development. However, it is possible to have economic growth but without development. For example, GDP may rise but no improvements in living standards, such as improvements in health, education, or other aspects of human welfare to benefit the society. And secondly, it helps managing the country. How? Is by giving information about the size of the economy, like how they are performing, especially for policymakers, investors, and businesses. Usually rely on GDP concept to help assess the economy well-being before they make any decisions to invest in the country. And thirdly, to compare countries' performances. GDP, or to be specific, real GDP, are often used to compare countries' performances. For example, an increase in real GDP is interpreted as a sign that the country or the economy is doing well if it is being compared to other country. And now moving on to the evaluation part. So what does it mean by a high GDP and a low GDP? So people actually always misunderstood that high GDP means better living standards and low GDP means low living standards. Actually, this is not the case because using GDP alone is actually too narrow of an indicator for an economic development, because it can be concluded that high GDP means better living standards and low GDP means low living standards. This is because of some certain reasons, as GDP does not take into account and measure welfare, as it may be unreliable and inaccurate. So if people want to measure welfare, then it is better to use other methods such as MEW, which is measure of economic welfare, or HDI, Human Development Index, or MPI, Multidimensional Poverty Index. And lastly, is GDP useful? Yes, GDP is useful if it is being used in the right way and in the right context. Despite of that, This does not mean that GDP cannot be used as a means of judging economic performances. It's just that GDP statistics are not meant to be a measure of welfare, and they are only working as a method and measure of output and income, and should only be seen in that context. And with that marks the end of our video. So thank you for listening. Any questions can just type in the comment section. And thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.